I am here to present my findings on how the gender lens has impacted specific infrastructure projects. As we all know, infrastructure is the backbone of every economy. Even though women and children are important users of infrastructure assets, unfortunately, most infrastructure assets were not developed, like existing assets were not developed with a gender lens. And according to UNOPS, this has led to further deepening of gender inequalities, leaving women and girls more vulnerable and putting their lives at risk. The fact that men are major players in terms of decision-making, shaping of policies within the space has not helped. For this research, or for the research, I focused on three important asset classes: residential housing, water and waste, and transportation. In terms of findings, there are two key things. Number one, infrastructure projects, for them to be more inclusive, gender inclusive, I found that developers and planners needed to engage in consultations, but not just engaging in consultations, being creative about it was really important. So being able to create tailored approaches to ensure that women and other marginalized groups within communities can participate and provide genuine input in stakeholder consultations. Now, the other bit is around implications for leadership. So basically, having diverse teams or having women play a major role in those teams ensure that those projects were inclusive, so to speak, especially at design and planning stage. Now, those two things, when you bring them together, you realize that there are three key outcomes. Number one, in terms of the designs, you have much more gender-based inputs or features for this project. And not just that, you have costs. Costs for these projects did not necessarily seem to be greater than for other projects, but then timeline was extended. Now, in terms of the cost, I would like to say that even though you get to have more features versus a typical infrastructure project, the fact is it didn't necessarily cost more to implement those features.
My research topic was around performative allyship within academic institutions, really exploring student experiences with allyship in order to understand what are their barriers to effective performative allyship. So to give you some context, despite a high degree of intentionality in being a good ally, modern allyship is often limited to its performatory aspects. Individuals are becoming increasingly aware about the roles that they play in influencing systemic change, and they are willing to take on these roles of allyship. Unfortunately, there exists a bit of an intent-action gap, which limits their authentic participation. So I really wanted to explore this phenomena within academic institutions. And so my research objective was really to understand and examine the current experiences of students as they navigate inclusion and allyship during a transformative period in their lives. Here is really the limitation of existing equity, diversity, and inclusion programming. So despite an increasing number of EDI initiatives that are usually driven by administration, there are key structural barriers that exist that limit expansive and authentic participation from students. Second is this idea of defaulting to clustering, where despite ample intersectional diversity within these institutions, students tend to cluster within their familiar social circles, which limits their understanding of other groups. And finally is this idea of cost of social discomfort, which weighs significantly higher than any individual's desire to be a good ally, which can lead to intentional and unintentional gaps in authentic allyship.
During the past year and also throughout my whole life, I have witnessed and experienced many racist, sexist, or homophobic comments. And I noticed that in general, there was silence in the response to this event. Even in my case, I haven't spoken up in many times. So I decided to focus this project on answering this question: how to disrupt silence when discriminatory events happen. One of the things that I found for both bystanders or people targeted of the discriminatory event is that after we experience or witness this event, it takes seconds or a few minutes for us to make an assessment on ourselves. For example, if I am the only woman in the room or the only person of color in the room, we also assess our position in relation to power or our perceived ability to handle the situation. Then we also assess the situation to identify how much support we might get, if there can be repercussions of speaking up, if we make a quick assessment to guess what the majority might think. And the key part is that if we find signals that tell us that we can experience negative repercussions for being outcasted, we tend to choose not to speak up. So the first thing is to know where you stand in your journey, if you have spoken up in the past or not, your environment, the policies of your organization, then finding safe spaces to practice and also learn when and how to do it. And finally, identify role models to learn from them. And remember that it is a process.
The topic that I explored is equity at home. More specifically, what are equitable partnerships? What makes these partnerships equitable? And crucially, what role do men play in establishing this equity? What does an equitable partner really mean? Well, let's start off by what it isn't. From my interviews, I gather that equitable partnership does not mean equal, it's not a clean 50-50 split. And everybody that I spoke to agreed that the weight of a relationship constantly shifts between partners. Equitable partnerships at the collective level require active teamwork. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Working as one unit, responsibilities in equitable partnerships are shared, perhaps not equally, but they're definitely flexible and renegotiable. Nothing is really set in stone, and partners adapt to changing needs. Decision-making is not monopolized by one person. Rather, it is joint or cooperative. An interesting point in the data is the quote that you see right on the right-hand side of the slide, which says that power in a relationship is not concentrated with the person who earns the most. Even non-monetary contributions to a relationship are considered equally valuable. Partners who choose to lead with empathy, anticipating each other's needs, understanding each other's strengths and limitations, and quickly pivoting to substitute one another are ones who tend to be more successful. If they were to follow traditional gender roles, this would not be possible. Lastly, and most interestingly, there's a great emphasis laid on maintaining the emotional health of the family, which is a shared responsibility which consists of providing comfort, respect, enabling and supporting each other to grow.
I'll be speaking today about the deepening impact of COVID on women-led SMEs in Africa. And my case study is Nigeria. So according to World Bank, women in Africa make up 58% of the continent's self-employed population. In that same report, it is stated that more women than men in Africa choose to be entrepreneurs. But I would say that it is not a choice. Sometimes it is born out of a necessity to provide for their families. A lot of these businesses also, Africa is said to be the world leader in female entrepreneurship. However, a lot of these businesses are disproportionately informal, and they also participate in in less profitable sectors of the economy. And that way, they are more vulnerable to shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic. I have firsthand experience as an entrepreneur in Africa. Although very brief, I know firsthand some of the difficulties, even prior to COVID, some of the difficulties some of these women faced in order to sustain or even scale their businesses. 4 key findings I gathered from the interviews that ran across most of the women I spoke with, and they were reduced productivity, limited access to capital, gender-based technology gaps, and operational challenges. Even when they're tailoring solutions, these solutions should not only be focused on the female entrepreneurs, it should be focused on developing the pipeline, something like the bookkeeping example that I made, or even building a strategy document or a business plan. Some of those skills or solutions should be defined so that the women, young ladies that are coming up in the entrepreneurship pipeline are already equipped before they even venture into the business. So they start with a strong foundation.